The following program contains graphic descriptions of violence and may include disturbing content. Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome to another gripping episode of Evil Exposed Killers. Tonight, we uncover one of the most horrific and unsettling cases of abuse and murder in American history. This is the story of Gertrude Baniszewski, a woman whose name became synonymous with unimaginable cruelty. Known as the Torture Mother, Gertrude orchestrated a reign of terror that led to the tragic death of a young girl, Sylvia Likens. Join us as we delve into the depths of this harrowing tale, exploring the dark forces that drove Gertrude's sadistic actions and the quest for justice that followed. This is a story of unimaginable evil and the devastating impact it had on a community. Brace yourselves for a journey into the darkest corners of human nature as we expose the horrifying truth behind the Torture Mother. Gertrude Nadine Baniszewski, born on September 19, 1928, in Indianapolis, Indiana, grew up in a large family facing financial difficulties. Her early years were marked by instability, which foreshadowed the troubled path she would later follow. At 16, she married John Baniszewski, a local police officer. Their marriage produced 4 children, but was fraught with domestic abuse and financial woes. After 10 tumultuous years, Gertrude divorced John and entered a series of failed relationships, eventually having a total of 7 children from different marriages. By 1965, Gertrude was living in a rundown rental house in Indianapolis, struggling to provide for her children. She relied on taking in boarders and doing odd jobs to make ends meet. The home was chaotic and overcrowded, a reflection of Gertrude's desperate financial situation. It was within this context of hardship and instability that Sylvia and Jenny Likens entered her life. Lester and Betty Likens, carnival workers, needed someone to care for their daughters while they traveled for work. Gertrude agreed to take in Sylvia, 16, and Jenny, 15, for $20 a week. At first, the arrangement seemed ordinary. The Likens sisters settled into the Baniszewski household, unaware of the nightmare that awaited them. The payments from the Likens' parents were sporadic, exacerbating Gertrude's financial stress. Her frustration and resentment grew, and she began to take out her anger on Sylvia. The abuse started subtly, with Gertrude reprimanding Sylvia for minor infractions, but it quickly escalated into physical violence. Gertrude would slap Sylvia, pull her hair, and subject her to other forms of physical humiliation. The psychological torment was equally severe, as Gertrude berated Sylvia with cruel and demeaning language, eroding her sense of self-worth. As the weeks passed, the abuse intensified. Gertrude's children, Paula, John, Stephanie, and the younger ones, were drawn into the cycle of violence. Encouraged by their mother, they began to participate in tormenting Sylvia. Neighborhood children, attracted to the chaotic Baniszewski household, also became involved, turning Sylvia's suffering into a grotesque form of entertainment. The cruelty Gertrude inflicted on Sylvia knew no bounds. She denied Sylvia food, forcing her to eat scraps and leftovers. She subjected Sylvia to acts of extreme degradation. One particularly horrific incident involved Sylvia being forced to strip naked and endure humiliations in front of others. This public degradation was meant to break her spirit and assert Gertrude's dominance. The neighborhood children watched and sometimes participated, turning Sylvia's torture into a macabre spectacle. One of the most egregious acts of cruelty involved branding Sylvia with a heated needle. The phrase inscribed on Sylvia's stomach was intended to permanently humiliate and mark her. This act demonstrated the extent of Gertrude's sadistic nature and her complete lack of empathy. Sylvia's once healthy appearance deteriorated rapidly. She became gaunt and withdrawn, her body bearing the marks of relentless beatings and burns. Despite her suffering, Sylvia tried to reach out for help. She attempted to confide in friends and neighbors, but Gertrude's manipulative control over the household thwarted each attempt. Gertrude instilled fear in those around her, ensuring that Sylvia's cries for help went unanswered. The few adults who noticed Sylvia's condition failed to intervene, either out of disbelief or indifference. As the months passed, Sylvia's condition worsened. She became increasingly frail, her spirit broken by the relentless abuse. The once vivacious teenager was now a shadow of her former self, her body covered in bruises, burns, and cuts. Gertrude's cruelty showed no signs of abating, and the abuse continued with horrifying regularity. In the final weeks of Sylvia's life, the abuse reached an unbearable intensity. Gertrude and her accomplices would burn Sylvia with cigarettes, beat her with belts, and subject her to other forms of torture. Sylvia was often tied up and left in the basement, a dark and cold space where she was isolated and further tormented. Her physical and emotional state deteriorated rapidly as the abuse continued unabated. One of the most disturbing incidents occurred when Gertrude forced Sylvia to insert a glass Coca-Cola bottle into her vagina while being watched by Gertrude's children and neighborhood kids. This act of sexual humiliation and violence was designed to utterly degrade and break Sylvia. Her screams and cries for help were ignored, her suffering a source of twisted entertainment for her tormentors. The final days of Sylvia's life were marked by unimaginable pain and despair. Gertrude and her accomplices intensified their abuse, sensing that Sylvia's will to live was fading. Sylvia was barely able to stand, her body covered in open sores and bruises. On October 25, 1965, Sylvia made a desperate attempt to escape, but she was too weak. Gertrude caught her and brutally beat her, further sealing her fate. On October 26, 1965, Sylvia Likens succumbed to her injuries. Her body was discovered in a horrific state, bearing the evidence of months of relentless torture. The autopsy revealed over 150 wounds, including burns, bruises, and cuts. The coroner's report detailed brain swelling, internal hemorrhaging, and severe malnutrition. Sylvia's death was ruled a homicide, and the investigation quickly focused on Gertrude Baniszewski and her household. The discovery of Sylvia Likens' battered body sent shockwaves through the Indianapolis community. The extent of her injuries was appalling, and the details of her suffering horrified the nation. The police investigation quickly focused on Gertrude Baniszewski and her household. As more details emerged, the horrific nature of the abuse Sylvia had endured became clear. The arrest of Gertrude Baniszewski, along with her children Paula, John, Stephanie, and several neighborhood kids, marked the beginning of a highly publicized and sensational trial. The prosecution's case was built on the overwhelming evidence of the systematic torture and abuse that Sylvia had suffered at the hands of Gertrude and her accomplices. The trial began in April 1966, attracting significant media attention. The courtroom was filled with tension as witnesses took the stand to recount the gruesome acts of violence inflicted upon Sylvia. The testimonies were harrowing, painting a vivid picture of the daily torment Sylvia endured. One of the most powerful testimonies came from Jenny Likens, Sylvia's younger sister. Despite her own trauma and fear, Jenny bravely recounted the months of torture her sister endured. Her detailed account of the abuse provided crucial evidence of Gertrude's cruelty and manipulation. Jenny described how Sylvia was beaten, burned, and starved, and how Gertrude and her children forced her to perform degrading acts. The prosecution also called several neighborhood children to testify. These children had witnessed and, in some cases, participated in the abuse. Their testimonies corroborated Jenny's account and revealed the extent of Gertrude's control over the household. The children described how Gertrude encouraged them to join in the torture, turning Sylvia's suffering into a twisted form of entertainment. As the trial progressed, the defense attempted to portray Gertrude as a victim of circumstances and mental instability. They argued that Gertrude's actions were the result of her own troubled past and financial desperation. However, the prosecution countered this narrative by highlighting the premeditated and systematic nature of the abuse. They emphasized Gertrude's role as the orchestrator of the torture, showing that she actively encouraged and participated in the torment of Sylvia. One of the most damning pieces of evidence presented was the testimony regarding the branding incident. Witnesses described how Gertrude had heated a needle and forced Sylvia to allow her to brand her stomach with the words, "I'm a prostitute, and proud of it." This act of extreme cruelty demonstrated Gertrude's sadistic nature and her intent to permanently humiliate Sylvia. The emotional impact of the trial was profound. The courtroom was often filled with gasps and tears as the graphic details of Sylvia's abuse were recounted. The public followed the trial closely, expressing outrage and disbelief at the level of cruelty inflicted upon Sylvia. The media coverage further fueled public anger, and calls for justice for Sylvia Likens grew louder. After weeks of emotional and gut-wrenching testimonies, the jury reached a verdict. On May 19, 1966, Gertrude Baniszewski was found guilty of first-degree murder. Her daughter Paula was convicted of second-degree murder, while the other participants received varying sentences for their roles in the abuse. The convictions brought a sense of justice for Sylvia Likens, but the emotional scars left on her family and those involved in the case were deep and lasting. Gertrude Baniszewski was sentenced to life imprisonment. Her time in prison was marked by a series of appeals and parole hearings. Despite her attempts to secure release, she remained incarcerated for nearly 2 decades. In 1985, after serving 20 years, she was granted parole. Her release was met with public outrage and disbelief, as many believed she should have remained behind bars for the rest of her life. Gertrude Baniszewski's life after prison was relatively quiet. She changed her name to Nadine Van Fossen and lived in obscurity until her death from lung cancer on June 16, 1990. Her passing closed a dark chapter in American criminal history, but the memory of Sylvia Likens and the lessons from her tragic story continue to resonate. The legacy of Sylvia Likens' case led to increased awareness and changes in child protection laws. It underscored the importance of vigilance and intervention in cases of suspected abuse. The story of Gertrude Baniszewski serves as a stark reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the necessity of community and legal safeguards to protect the most vulnerable among us. The haunting memory of Sylvia Likens' suffering has left an indelible mark on those who followed the case. Her tragic story has been recounted in books, documentaries, and films, each serving to remind the public of the importance of standing against abuse and ensuring that such atrocities are never repeated. The case has become a touchstone for discussions about child welfare, the responsibility of bystanders, and the imperative for a compassionate and vigilant society. Sylvia's family, despite their profound grief, continued to honor her memory by advocating for stronger protections for children. Their tireless efforts contributed to the establishment of more stringent child abuse reporting laws and greater public awareness of the signs of abuse. Sylvia's story, though heartbreaking, has become a powerful catalyst for change, inspiring countless individuals and organizations to work towards a world where no child suffers in silence. In conclusion, The story of Gertrude Baniszewski and the unimaginable cruelty she inflicted upon Sylvia Likens is a dark and tragic chapter in history. It is a stark reminder of the potential for evil that can exist in ordinary settings and the devastating impact it can have on innocent lives. Through the legacy of Sylvia Likens, we are reminded of our collective responsibility to protect and care for the vulnerable among us, ensuring that such horrors are never allowed to occur again. The tragic story of Sylvia Likens serves as a haunting reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the devastating consequences of unchecked abuse. Gertrude Baniszewski's reign of terror over Sylvia is a dark chapter that shocked a nation and led to important changes in child protection laws. As we reflect on this heartbreaking case, let us remember Sylvia's spirit and the lessons her story has imparted. It is our collective responsibility to remain vigilant, to speak out against abuse, and to protect the most vulnerable among us. Sylvia's legacy continues to inspire change, reminding us that through awareness and action, we can prevent such atrocities from happening again. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Evil Exposed Killers. Stay tuned for more stories where we uncover the darkest corners of human nature and seek justice for those who can no longer speak for themselves. Until next time, stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember, evil thrives in silence.